Leo used to think he could spot wealth: the car someone drove, the watch on their wrist, the neighborhood they lived in, the restaurants they chose on a Friday night. He'd built a mental picture of what financial success looked like, and for most of his 20s, that picture felt accurate. Then he met someone who didn't fit it at all, and everything he thought he understood about money turned out to be wrong. Growing up, Leo absorbed the same lesson most people absorb without realizing it. Wealth has a look. It's the car that makes people glance twice in a car park, the apartment on the right floor of the right building, the clothes that signal, without saying anything directly, that the person wearing them has arrived somewhere. Nobody told Leo this explicitly. It came from everywhere at once: television, social media, the way certain people were spoken about with a particular kind of admiration. He noticed which colleagues drove expensive cars. He noticed who wore certain brands. He noticed who took certain kinds of holidays and talked about them in a certain kind of way, and he filed all of it, unconsciously, as evidence. Evidence of who had made it. Evidence of what success looked like from the outside. By the time Leo reached his late 20s, he'd built a clear idea of what he was working toward. He just hadn't questioned whether that picture was real. The people Leo admired. There was a man named Derek at Leo's company. Derek drove a car that turned heads in the office car park. He wore a watch Leo had looked up once out of curiosity. The price had surprised him. He talked about restaurants as if they were ordinary choices, mentioned holidays as if the cost was irrelevant, and carried himself with the easy confidence of someone who had never worried about money. People noticed Derek. People respected Derek. Leo noticed. Leo respected. For 2 years, Leo quietly used Derek as a reference point. If Derek could live like that on a senior manager's salary, then Leo, who was still a few rungs below, had something concrete to aim for. Then one afternoon, Leo learned, through no particular gossip, that Derek had recently taken out a personal loan to cover a shortfall after a rough few months. The watch was still on his wrist. The car was still in the car park. Nothing on the outside had changed, but something shifted in Leo's understanding of what he'd been looking at. The quiet man. Around the same time, Leo started occasionally sharing a lift with a man named Arthur. Arthur worked 2 floors above Leo in a consultancy role. He was in his mid-50s, quietly spoken, and entirely unremarkable in appearance. He drove a car that was several years old. He brought his own coffee in a scratched travel mug. His clothes were plain, good quality if you looked closely, but nothing that announced itself. He didn't talk about holidays. He didn't mention restaurants. He was, in every visible way, the kind of person Leo had never particularly noticed before. Then one day their conversation turned to retirement planning. Arthur mentioned, without dramatizing it, that he had been financially independent for 3 years. He was still working because he wanted to, not because he had to. Leo looked at the travel mug in Arthur's hand and didn't know what to say. Leo went home that evening and thought about both men. Derek, with the car and the watch and the loan. Arthur, with the scratched mug and the freedom to walk away from work tomorrow if he chose to, from the outside. Leo had spent 2 years reading Derek as the wealthier man. He'd been reading it completely backwards. The realization wasn't comfortable, because if he'd been wrong about Derek and Arthur, he'd also been wrong about what he'd been chasing and what he'd been spending money to signal to other people. Leo thought about his own wardrobe, his own car, which he'd upgraded 18 months earlier partly because the old one had started to embarrass him in certain car parks. The apartment he'd moved to specifically because the address felt like the right kind of address. None of it was reckless. None of it was beyond his means in a catastrophic way, but all of it had been chosen, at least in part, because of how it looked, and none of it was building anything. Why status costs more than it appears? Leo asked Arthur about this directly the next time they shared the lift. He asked how Arthur had ended up where he was while seeming to spend so little on appearances. Arthur thought for a moment and said something Leo wrote down that evening. He said, "Every pound you spend on looking wealthy is a pound that isn't becoming wealthy. The difference between those two things is the whole game." He wasn't talking about deprivation. He wasn't suggesting nobody should ever buy anything expensive. He was talking about the gap between consumption and accumulation. Every expensive car that gets financed. Every designer item bought on a credit card. Every apartment upgraded for reasons more social than practical. All of it is money flowing outward. Money that will not return, will not compound, will not build anything over time. The visible markers of wealth, Arthur said, are mostly purchased by people who are trading future security for present appearance. The people who actually accumulate wealth over time are often the ones you'd never guess by looking. That conversation stayed with Leo for days. One evening, he sat at his desk and started searching, not for investment tips or financial plans, but for something more basic. He wanted to understand what wealthy people actually owned, not what they wore, not where they lived, what they held. He came across study after study saying the same thing in different ways. A significant portion of people with high net worth lived in ordinary neighborhoods, drove ordinary cars, and spent far less than they could afford to. Not all of them, not even most, but enough to make the pattern impossible to ignore. What they held instead of status symbols were things that didn't show up anywhere visible: business ownership, index funds, rental properties, shares bought quietly over decades and never discussed at dinner. Leo sat back and thought about Arthur's scratched travel mug sitting on his desk every morning. He'd spent 2 years looking past Arthur entirely. The whole time, Arthur had been the answer to a question Leo hadn't known to ask, the version of rich nobody posts about. Leo noticed something else during those late evenings of reading. The version of wealth that accumulates quietly doesn't photograph well. An index fund balance isn't something you take a picture of in a car park. A paid-off property doesn't look like anything from the outside. Living below your means, by definition, produces nothing visible, which is why nobody posts it, and why nobody absorbs it as evidence of success. Social media is a permanent exhibition of consumption: holidays, restaurants, cars, clothes, occasions. It is not an exhibition of net worth, but the brain doesn't always make that distinction. It processes what it sees. It absorbs signals. It builds a picture of what success looks like based on what's visible, and what's visible is almost always the spending, not the building. Leo had spent years letting that exhibition shape what he was working toward, without realizing that the people he was watching might be spending everything they earned to appear in it. What Arthur had done differently. Leo asked Arthur one more question. He asked when Arthur had started thinking about money the way he did. Arthur said he'd made every mistake Leo could imagine in his 20s. The car, the apartment he couldn't quite afford, the clothes that felt like evidence he was going somewhere. Then at 31, he'd sat down and calculated his actual net worth for the first time. Not his income, not his salary. His net worth, what he actually owned, minus what he owed. The number had been small, embarrassingly small for a man who had been earning well for almost a decade. And the gap between what he earned and what he'd accumulated came down to one thing. He'd been spending money to look like the destination before he'd done any of the work to actually get there. From that point, Arthur said, he stopped optimizing for appearance and started optimizing for accumulation. The travel mug had been with him ever since. What Leo finally understood. Leo didn't sell his car the next day. He didn't empty his wardrobe, but something fundamental changed in how he saw money moving through his life. He started separating two questions that he'd always treated as the same question. The first, does this make my life look a certain way? The second, does this build anything? Both are valid questions. Both have a place. But he'd spent years letting the first question answer for the second, assuming that if something looked like success, it was moving him toward success. It wasn't. Appearance and accumulation are not the same process. They often require opposite decisions. The money that buys the car cannot also compound in an investment account. The money that services a lifestyle at the edge of your income cannot also build a foundation underneath it. Every financial decision is a direction, and direction, repeated over years, determines where you actually end up, regardless of what the journey looked like to the people watching. Leo still thinks about Derek sometimes, not with judgment, more with recognition, because he understands now that Derek was doing what most people do. Using money to communicate something, to signal a position, to show, to whoever was watching, that he'd arrived somewhere worth noticing. The problem is that the signal costs money, and money used for signaling is money not used for building. The gap between those two uses, over a decade, is often the gap between the person who looks wealthy and the person who actually is. Arthur understood this early. Leo understood it later than he wished. Most people understand it last, if at all. The quiet truth about wealth is that it rarely looks the way we were taught to expect. It doesn't announce itself. It doesn't need to. It's in the accounts that don't photograph well, the assets that nobody can see from the car park, the financial freedom that has no visible marker. The easiest way to look rich is to spend money. The way that actually makes you rich is almost always the quieter one. And the difference between those two paths is usually the distance between where someone appears to be and where they actually end up.